For that introduction and for inviting me here today. I'm really delighted to be here.
I'm sorry I didn't get your name.
Sorry, it's Chrissie Gale. And I'm going to start, before telling you who I am, a bit of an admission, and I mentioned this to Tanya earlier. I'm a little bit nervous. Believe it or not, I'm used to standing in front of the United Nations in places like New York. I've spoken to a lot of parliaments, but when I'm speaking to my peers, that makes me a little bit nervous, so forgive me. I have spent 35 years, if you like, as an international aid worker, working in everywhere but the UK, working in particularly low and middle income countries on issues of child rights, taking that down to child protection and a lot of work with children in alternative care. I've worked for UNICEF, UNHCR, OCHA, UNRWA, who nobody had heard of until the Gaza situation. I've worked for Save the Children International, Oxfam, so I've worked for many different UN and international agencies. And then about 10 years, and I was a frontline practitioner. And so, for instance, my roles would be head of country for maybe Save the Children. I was chief of child protection for UNICEF in various countries. And I've worked both at policy and very much frontline level. And I've done a lot of work in war zones, so Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Kosovo, working on child protection. And then approximately 10 years ago, I decided I was coming in from the cold, so to speak. And I was lucky to get a post with ratified University. I just finished my doctorate. So I have 2 masters, which I did whilst I was working full time. I was suddenly thinking about that today. And my doctorate while I was working full time. I finished my doctorate and I got offered a post as the international lead in a department within the School of Social Policy and Social Work at Strathclyde University. I remained there full time for 4.5 years. Decided I wanted to stop traveling so much. So went freelance. And then found I had far too much work to do. But I am still an associate research, senior research fellow with the university I teach. And I also teach at various other universities as a part of that fellowship. The last 10 years in particular, I've been around the world doing a lot of frontline work, research for the European Union, for different international agencies, particularly, as Tanya said, making sure that we bring forth the voice of children and young people and those who are experiencing different situations and different challenges in their life. So the reason I've chosen this slide is today I'm going to talk to you about an ongoing research project, which is particularly underpinned by this grave importance of giving voice, of supporting, providing the opportunity for children and young people to say what's important to them, to talk about their experiences, to expect their views and opinions, and for us to listen to what they think has to change. And this is particularly around the issue of children who have been removed from parental family care and placed in the form of alternative care in low and middle income countries. That's really the essence of my research. And these are some quotations taken from a project that I was fortunate to be on a working group for, which was to set up the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child Day of General Discussion in September 2021, which, because of Anne Skelton, who was the chair at that time, who had a great interest in alternative care, the focus of that DGD was on children's rights and alternative care. And so as part of preparation for that day, there was work done with children and young people in care all around the world and care leavers. And these are just some of the things they said. These are just a few, but being able to talk your heart out, the fact that we listen to them, having good alternative care that makes them feel secure, safe and sound, needing to be consulted about their lives. These are things that really motivate my work. And so I wanted to start by putting their voices first. So I have a very complex working title for my research at the moment, and I'll speak a little bit about how this title came about. But basically, my research is so that we can look at the attainment of human rights and improving the well-being outcomes for children and young people in foster care and small-scale residential care, particularly in low and middle income countries. And I am going to start by speaking about definitions because there's a lot to unpack in that title. What do I mean by some of these terms? I'm going to say a little bit, well, quite a lot actually, about the background and motivation for this project. And I have to say some of it is based on research, but some of it is very much based on my frontline experience, particularly in the last 10 to 20 years. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research to date. And I have to say it has been a little bit stop-start, and hopefully what comes next. And then please somebody stop me so that there's at least 15 or 20 minutes for questions at the end. So why definitions? Well, you know that definitions are really important. We have to be very clear about who and what we're talking about. And I do find in a lot of research, sometimes I have to really unpack what's been written to understand what people are actually talking about. And in terms of defining children and young people, that's also quite difficult because different people use different age groups. And particularly when I'm looking at quant data, you know, some people do something on 0 to 9-year-olds and others will do, then it'll go 10 to 17 or 18 or 19, and I can't disaggregate the data. So at the moment, I'm being very clear that what I mean by children, because I very much, my life is ruled by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, I'm using 0 to 17 years going forward as a definition for child, although it does also say in the UN Convention, as you all know, which has been ratified by every country in the world now, apart from one, which is the USA. They're the only country in the world that has not ratified and signed the convention. Most countries now are adapting their legislation not to the age of majority, as it has been, such as in Scotland, but now to the UN Convention, and particularly countries that have started to use this for their legislation in the last 25 years or so. They are now, I notice across the board in many countries, 0 to 17 is the age that they're referring to. Young people, as far as I'm aware, and if anybody knows of this, please let me know, I cannot find an international formal definition of young person. The United Nations gave a list of definitions in 2013, and they named 15 to 24-year-olds as young people. That sort of doesn't resonate when it comes to 0 to 17-year-old, but I think there's a discussion to be had there, because obviously it's about also ability and competency. But I'm using 18 to 25 at the moment in my study, because in general, that is the age that young people leave care in different parts of the world. So across Africa, for instance, I've just done a big project with 10 countries in Africa on care leaving. And there, the vast majority leave at 25. So this is why I've used the 18 to 25. Low and middle income, high income countries, you'll hear me talk about a lot. I personally, and this is just me, I don't like global south and global north. What does that mean? I don't like developed and developing. I don't like industrializing. This is a preference, but also those terms are not, again, internationally defined, whereas the World Bank has a very, very defined understanding of how they say something is a low, middle, or high income country. And in my experience, and this is really maybe not very academic or sound, but most definitely, if it's a low-income country, there are definitely certain socio-political issues that go alongside that do affect children. Why am I defining foster care? Because again, in many parts of the world, foster care is small group homes. So for instance, the USA and South America, you have to read very carefully the papers, just try and find out what they're talking about when they talk about foster care, because it is small group homes as well as family-based care. So the other thing that guides my life is the UN Guidelines for the Alternative Care of Children that was issued in 2010, and I've done a lot of work with these guidelines. And in fact, Celsus department I was based in wrote the handbook to accompany these guidelines called Moving Forward. And so I'm using foster care as being children placed in the domestic environment of a family other than children's own family. I'm particularly talking about formally placed, not informal foster care, but we also know that around the world, millions of children in formal kinship care, and we now indeed have kinship foster care. And small-scale residential care is incredibly controversial in the world I work in. Some people saying there should be no residential care whatsoever anywhere in the world. I personally argue against that because I've worked with many young people who said we don't want to go into foster care, or foster care is not for us. But there is no definition, although the UNICEF is about to announce some more newly developed definitions. But at the moment, I'm taking a working group definition that a group of experts came together in Geneva in 2020 and wrote a paper for UNICEF that defines small-scale residential care as being public or private registered non-family based arrangement, providing temporary care, and temporary is a very important word for us, for groups of 4 to 6 children. So that's the smallest group that's been defined anywhere I've seen. The European Union had a definition of 6 to 8, staffed by highly trained salary carers, i.e. this is not family, this is actually professionals caring for children. So why is this research important? Well, I've been working for many, many years on what we call DI, deinstitutionalization, which is the closure of large residential institutions. And I have been in many, many, many around the world. And I can tell you that these photographs are pretty good looking institutions compared to a lot I've been. This process particularly started to come to the fore around 30 years ago when the Berlin Wall came down and we suddenly had access to these institutions in ex-Soviet countries. I've been into residential institutions where there have been up to 200, 300 children. I went to one, I remember, in Macedonia, where honestly and truthfully, I couldn't believe what I saw. And I think this was quite typical of a lot of residential institutions. Babies tied to beds, children with adults, no supervision. It was a really horrendous situation. And this really motivated, particularly UNICEF, to do what I call, to look at child protection systems approach, i.e. not just closing residential institutions, as they did in Romania, and all children were out in the street overnight, literally. And now they've taken them all back and realised they have to do a much more careful process, taking the whole child protection systems approach, legislation, policy, resource, staffing, training, etc., and thinking really carefully about care reform. But I can say this as being a pushing or an encouraging process because I have to hold my hand up and say, I've been partially responsible for this over the years as we learn how to do this better and support particularly low and middle income countries and governments to develop good quality family and intervention scale care. Because if we don't, there is no alternative to institutions. Yeah. And secondly, you also know, just to add a caveat to this, and you'll see some research I've been doing, thousands and thousands of these children don't need to be there. So the care reform system has to look at what we call the necessity principle. Is this really what is needed for this child? A lot of children are placed in institutions because of poverty, poor families are bad families, social workers don't have time to make other decisions, etc. And if they are going to place children in care for their protection, is this the most suitable placement for their individual needs and context? And we are failing, basically. And I'm sorry, I say we because I'm part of a lot of global working groups. I've sat on a lot of UN working groups and other international platforms. And we're actually quite a small group of people. I know quite a lot of people around the world who are working on this, but it's been very piecemeal. And that's because we've had a carrot and stick approach, but the carrot hasn't been very big. And therefore, the whole process of encouraging governments in low and middle income countries to take on childcare reform, and always social policy departments or ministries of social policy or ministries of family and children are the poorest ministries. And so in a low and middle income country, that's really bottom of the barrel. And so they're very much dependent on international funding and international expertise to come in and support the process. And I have been part of that, but I'm hopefully learning how to do that in a supportive role better. So as a result, a lot of policy transfer, and this is my experience, but also there is quite a lot written about this, has been very top-down. it's very much being promoted. This is what's great in Scandinavia. This is what's great in the UK. Therefore, you should copy it. I'm going around thinking, well, actually, we don't get it all right, but it's particularly lacking contextualization and applicability. And for me, this is so important. And as I said, the available resources, particularly human and financial, to implement these forms of care in a really careful, well thought through, and well-resourced way. So as a result, development of legislation, policy and practice is not being informed by evidence, and most particularly, it's not being developed with the perspectives and the needs and priorities of those it most impact, which in this case is children and young people, but also their families, the caregivers, and the service providers. So whenever I've been doing research, particularly in the last 10 years, I've tried to make sure I involve all these stakeholders. But also, we've got to be very careful that the involvement of children and young people is not tokenistic, and that it's a really valuable process for them. And as Belle et al. Said in 2023, how is a country supposed to make useful systems for children without knowledge from those who are affected by these systems? So this really accumulated in a personal fear. I'd been going around the world working for ministries and for UN agencies, supporting this idea of deinstitutionalization, supporting governments evaluating their own systems, etc. But still, I felt, because of all these reasons I've just said, and particularly the lack of resources, that we're going to end up with poor and unsafe foster care and small-scale residential care. And indeed, I can give this anecdotal information. I was at an international conference and I met somebody who was on the AMPCAN, which is the Pan-African Association for Child Protection, and he told me of a village in Ghana, where Ghana was one of the first countries, along with Tanzania, who was really progressing with child protection system, good deinstitutionalization. And he said, there was this village, they got very interested in foster care, and so they took some children, and then a while later the village came back and said, oh, this is great, this works, we'll take some children. No social workers have been to visit because there wasn't resources. A social worker turned up and the children had gone, trafficked. I'd been working in Ukraine since 2012, I was there in 2014. There had been some good practice there. An international and national NGO was working with the government to instigate good thought through foster care. 2014, Orange Revolution, new administration, all the social workers were sacked. Nobody knows what happened to those children. Those are just two incidences. So it's very, very important that we don't go and say in 10 years' time, well, okay, we thought children were having a bad situation in institutions, but now we don't even know where they are. Give them away. An institution I went to, run by a charity in Ecuador, they allow people to come in and foster pretty little girls. And in 3 months' time, when they don't want them, they give them back. This really puts the fear of God in me. So this is why I wanted to instigate this research. But it's not too late. In many low middle-income countries, governments are sort of a very nascent state of developing alternatives. So I was recently in Kenya. Sorry, Tanya's heard this today, but I was recently in Kenya. They have amazing written legislation, policy, guidance, held up as a country really moving forward on foster care. But when I was there a year and a half ago, I interviewed social workers and they said it's a disaster. We don't have the resources, we don't have the training, we don't have the infrastructure, and maybe we've got 6 to 8 foster care families in the whole of Kenya at the moment. So that's bad news, but it's also good news in that we still have time to think very carefully with governments, or allow governments to think for themselves what is really necessary. Of course, the UNCRC, as I said, is very, very important and underpins the work that I do. And this gives children the right to express their views in matters that affect them. And particularly, and I've highlighted, in judicial and administrative proceedings, because very often children should be involved in making decisions about their care. In my research, this hardly ever happens in many countries. Social workers have to make very different decisions for very different reasons. Just did a deep dive into 4 different countries on the subjective and objective decision-making of social workers. It's very much lack of resources, lack of time, cultural pressure, cultural context that says, yeah, institutionalization is a good thing. And we won't listen to children because actually they're little people and they should be seen but not heard. And in many cases, they're not even seen. We don't know where they are. We have no data on institutions. There's been several studies, including one of mine, and we just don't know how many children are in alternative care around the world. I also was interested in looking at this, so I've started a scoping review to look and see exactly what it says in the published journals on care experienced children and young people's participation in research by country income status. I was particularly looking for papers, I used search terms that would particularly bring up papers where children were and young people were actively engaged in research. And I think that actively engaged was very important to me, i.e. In some shape or form, they were part of the research. It wasn't just data used about them. I do understand that the analysis of secondary data can be very useful and is important, but I want to see how are children actually having their voices heard, about their opinions and their ideas of their current care experience, the impact it's having on them whilst in care, but also the long-term wellbeing outcomes. And what did they think should change? Is this in the research? So out of the records I found, you'll see that I assessed 382 for eligibility. This has come down to 230 in terms of active participation, but these 382 did claim to have real participation in some shape or form. And I found this very interesting. Now, I understand that one of the caveats is, and this is something I've been trying to work on as well, is that many of my colleagues in universities and in research around the world don't have the opportunity to publish. So I take that in mind, but out of all the papers I've now analysed, you will see that 334 reported on research in high income countries and only 2 in low income countries, 3 that had a middle and a low income country, and 2 that was conducted in high, middle and low, of which one is mine. So I think that was something I knew and guessed, but is very telling by this review. And just so for your interest, you can see that the vast majority, nearly half or a third rather, came from the USA. Then we have Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada, and then to varying degrees, which I was quite surprised, or maybe it's because I did research in any language, but mostly English papers came up. I was surprised there wasn't more from Scandinavia. But this is just a glimpse of what I found. And please don't quote me on this because I'm still analysing it, and I did this on the train coming down yesterday. But out of the 382 papers, mostly these were around working with care experienced young people aged 18 and more, and some of those were even 32, 46-year-olds. So they weren't the voices of children. Now, care leavers is very, very important, but I also wanted to see what was happening with children. Most of the papers are around the issue of transition or leaving care, not about what's actually happening in care, and a lot around health and education rather than holistic understanding of what quality of care should be and the impact on many of wellbeing outcomes that children should be afforded. So as a result, very few were using participants 15 years and under, and within that, some did use quite a good number of children, but some only had 2 or 3 in the study. And that comes on about level of participation. Very few about children still in care. So 80 of the 382 studies, and I say don't quote me because I've got to go back and look at this again, were with children under 15. Only 3% of the papers were actually actively involving children in research design. 3.1% actually involved in any shape or form in designing the research, implementing peer-to-peer work, for example. And only 7 studies involve children with disabilities out of the 392. And mostly the methods were looking at using questionnaires, interviews, and focus group discussions. And obviously there's nothing wrong with those methods, but I was very interested in looking at more creative methodology that would allow a much wider, diverse group of children, young children, children with disabilities, for example, to be able to participate in research as well. So that's just a snapshot of what I've started to look at. But most importantly, what motivates our work? Well, because children have been told things have to change. These are photographs of young people and children, care experience children who attended the Day of General Discussion in Geneva in 2021. And again, these are just a couple of the quotations. And one young person said, "We have to be heard and considered experts of our lives in care." We're so overlooked in the case of planning, case management, how care is delivered. We are the ones who live through these decisions made by adults who often only have scholarly knowledge or service provision knowledge of what we have to live every day. Ask us. And then also saying we need the international community to take action. We need better alternative forms of care. But at the same time, we know there needs to be targeted action towards different regions and countries. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. And for me, that's really important in my research, the contextualization, the applicability. So, for example, I just did some work in Lebanon. Foster care is totally unaccepted. There has been pioneering of different forms of care there for quite a while now. But it's not accepted to take a child who is not of blood into your family. So there is kinship care, but not formal foster care. Whereas I've just finished a project with national researchers in Gaza and West Bank, particularly in response to the 82,000 children in Gaza who have now lost both parents in the last 2 years, and being asked by UNICEF and the Ministry of Social Policy to help them think about what is happening and what's needed. And we were able to ask children and young people. But there are very few children who've been left on the streets, believe it or not, because either extended family have taken them in, or we have what we call spontaneous care. And these are complete strangers struggling, living in tents, not able to feed their own children, but have not left children abandoned alone. So it's very much understanding what works where. So my response to all of this was to initiate a research programme. As I said, it's been a little bit stop-start as I got little bits of funding, as I had to go off and do other pieces of work, but I have been fortunate. I've had some money from the University of Strathclyde, from the Scottish Research Council, from some international NGOs, that allowed me to initiate this project. And I have been able to take on some consultancies that added my knowledge and understanding, and I could pilot some methodology during those projects as well. So the aim of this research would be to generate evidence that motivates and supports governments and their partners, other stakeholders in low and middle income countries to instigate a positive formal alternative care reform process. And what I mean by that is it's very important that I don't go in and say to governments, this is what you should do. Governments need to understand the situation on the ground themselves. They need to do that analysis. They need to own it and accept it, and to have a process that helps them do that. And that process should be informed by children and young people in care, that then leads to an outcome that they have their human rights realised and can secure the best possible wellbeing outcomes through their care experience. Something I was thinking about today, and something I did think about, and it's very complex, and I'm still in two minds whether to bring this into my research or not. But a lot of the research I've read says, well, one of the things we don't consider is the pre-care experience, and how does that impact wellbeing outcomes? And so that's something I'm grappling with at the moment. It's very complicated to do. So the idea would be to gather and use evidence that particularly addresses this lack of voices of children and young people, particularly in the design, the implementation, the analysis, and the use of the research. Some of the most amazing research I've had the privilege to be part of has been peer-to-peer research and findings that just blow your mind. And you think, well, I wouldn't have found this, I wouldn't have understood this. I've been able to work for the European Union and write practice guidance and training, instigate peer-to-peer training on things like trauma-informed practice, violence, preparing for leaving care, all based on voices of children and young people, which really I felt strongly gave us good evidence to move those projects forward. And in order to do that, to work with children and young people and with other researchers around the world and with governments to create participatory research methodology that is also applicable for use in different countries. With the hope that the outputs are that along in consultation with care experienced children and young people and with other researchers who support them to develop domains of well-being identified through consultation with them, that a set of well-being indicators provides a baseline in which to measure current care experience and identify the quality of care that they desire and deserve. That we then have a co-designed research methodology that promotes meaningful participation. What does meaningful mean? I'll come on to that. Adheres to ethical principles. And this concerns me about some of the research I see where the ethics has not been really well considered in terms of gaining consent or giving good information or safeguarding, etc. And that, as I say, it's suitable for replication across different contexts. And then that evidence informs a participatory process in a country that would lead to the development of legislation, policy and service provision for care reform. So what's happened to date? So I was fortunate to be given a little bit of money by an international NGO to form an international advisory group. This is us all meeting 2 years or so ago in Geneva. And this group is made up of people I knew and other people who people knew. I'm glad to say that there are care experienced young people from different countries there. We had a couple of ministers from different countries. We had international experts, people from academia and research, and also 3 members of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child joined the board. And we spent 2 days really hammering out, is this important? Is this research feasible? What should its aims and objectives be? And how should we move the research forward? And that sort of gave me a framework and sort of like a tick box, yes, Chrissie, go ahead and start on this research. And I was very much supported by the University of Strathclyde, UNICEF in New York. They helped form a sort of mini international advisory group that have stayed with me, and also an NGO that's based in Switzerland. I've also been conducting some scoping reviews, desk reviews, because as you see, I'm very interested to know, what does participation of children and young people mean in research? What are the different levels of participation? How are they defined? And what is meaningful participation? What is tokenism? How do we look at the different levels? And as you'll see, this is Shear's quite well-known diagram of levels of participation, not just in research, but in children participating in lots of different ways. You'll be aware of Hart's ladder of participation. So I was trying to find out if there's anything that's been done similar that's specifically around that has a graphic or charts. What are different levels of participation and what we mean by meaningful? And as you've seen, to what degree are care experienced children and young people participating in such in low, and middle income countries? So that piece of work's still underway. But what I have found so far is particularly a lack of consensus and understanding about terminology about when people describe participation. And that goes from people using secondary data, perhaps mental health records or school records, without perhaps children even knowing their data is being used, to full scale, right from the go, being able to involve children and young people in all the process of the research. But there's little conceptual clarity in how this is being described. And there's a recommendation that this clarity should be there in terms of terms and concepts and how we describe participation of children and documenting that process clearly. And what the conclusion there is, the result is we actually don't know what the true levels of participation are, even within the literature we have and the research programmes we're seeing. I have to say, I haven't looked at the grey literature yet. This is very much to do with published academic journals. But also the other main finding is this lack of participation is very often attributed to adult perceptions as children as passive beings. Why would we want to listen to them? What have they got to say? What do they know? And also the feeling that they may be too vulnerable to be exposed to the research process. So this specifically children who are young children with disabilities, children in challenging circumstances. Some people say vulnerable, some people say marginalised. I tend to use challenging. And they really are not too vulnerable in my experience. It's about how you do the work, how you support them, how you protect them through the process. I've also was fortunate to be funded by an international NGO, the Scottish Research Council, to employ a research associate for a year who was based in the University of Strathclyde. And together we worked on a research paper looking at the concepts of what does it say in the literature about the concepts of well-being, indicators and outcomes, and what sort of tools exist currently to measure those outcomes. And one of the main findings, and this is a quote from the paper we have published, is key findings included the limited mention of domains of identity. So who are we as children? How do we identify ourselves? How do people see us? Inclusion, the quality of services, our safety, support and trust as being more central to the holistic understanding of well-being that care experienced children and young people raised when we did the day of general discussion. That's what we sort of based our baseline on in terms of that paper. And also I've been very carefully looking at ethical frameworks and principles for research with children and young people, as well as participatory research methods. I'm very interested to know what other people are using and how they've been using them. Lastly, before I move on to what comes next, is I was very fortunate to be commissioned by an international NGO to undertake a project that spanned 8 low and middle and high income countries. So it's very interesting. We want to do the comparison here. And it actually wasn't about being in care. It was actually about what are the issues that cause separation of children from their families, and what can be done to prevent that unnecessary separation. This was very much, again, based on this regard for children and young people as increasingly being recognised as competent social actors, experts in their own lives, and that they do have an ability to represent themselves, articulate challenges, priorities, inside perspective, grounds and lived experience. And as I said, this is also very much my experience. I've been in many different countries working directly with children and young people in all forms of care, and listening to what they've had to say. And they really tell you, and they tell you straight, and they know exactly what's happening to them and what they want to change. So I worked through research partners. These were the 8 countries: Denmark, El Salvador, Uruguay, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Indonesia, Lebanon, Pakistan. And I'm glad they're written down because I keep reading them. And what was important to me was to work with research partners in these countries. So it was the national researchers who actually interfaced, particularly with children and young people. It wasn't me as a stranger coming in and saying to children, oh, tell me all about my lives, you know. And just that lack of communication and building trust when you only have a short time with children and young people. So I worked with national universities. That also allowed me to get ethical clearance from the ethics boards in each of these universities. But to work with them in each country, to work with children and young people, to help design and to evaluate the research methods, as well as we also did systems mapping. So we set it in context. We looked at the child protection systems in each country, and we also did a literature on the socio-economic context. So we knew what what context were these childcare reforms actually sitting in. Just to say, in terms of working with national colleagues, it was an amazing experience. I've now got some wonderful colleagues around the world. But in fact, in quite a few of the universities, they'd never worked on quality participatory research methods before. So there was a lot of work done upfront to work on what is qualitative research, the principles, the ethics, the approach, the values. And I was introduced to quite a lot of these universities by national NGOs or international NGOs, but very much when I was looking for partners in researchers, it wasn't necessarily just the experience, but it was very much about the aptitude and somebody who would immediately have a rapport with children and young people because we didn't have a lot of time, and also, you know, had this way of being able to communicate with children, which is so important in this research. What I was very lucky to be able to do was to work on co-development of the research questions and the creative participatory research methods, actually with children in care experienced children in El Salvador and in Lebanon. And in both places, we worked with children aged 13 to 15 who were not in care, but had been identified by social services at possible risk of separation from parental care, and of children who were young people who were care experienced. They first came to a meeting where they were informed about what the research would be. It was purposive sampling. It was very important to me. They knew what they were going to be engaged in, what it meant, what their participation would mean, and what the information would be used for. And if they said, yes, that's great, we'd like to still do it, we were able to have a 2-day workshop with each of the groups in the 2 of the countries, where we worked on saying, well, if this is what we want to find out, what should we ask? What do you think are the questions to ask other children and young people of your age, and not just in your country, but in other countries in similar situations? And they came up with a list of research questions. And then we went through, well, how do we find out this information? How do we answer these questions? I'd already, I wish I could have started with a blank sheet of paper and worked a long time with children and young people to start right from scratch creating these tools, but I didn't have the time or luxury to do that because there was already a cap on the funding I'd been given. So what I did was I created these different tools, creative methods that was very much based on participatory action research and young youth participatory action research that I've used in other countries working with children in institutions. And then we played with them, basically. We did lots of energizers and lots of icebreakers and tried to make it, because it's quite a serious situation to talk about what is happening in families, you know, what are the challenging things, what are the positive things. The challenging things was a very difficult question. We didn't say you're going to be at risk of losing parental care. I did not want to put that fear in children. So we just looked at the unity of families and what might impact that. But so we played with different tools and methods, and they got to try them out, and then they could evaluate them, alter them, make suggestions, and if they wanted, come up with even new ideas. We didn't actually come up with any new ideas, but I think that was due to lack of time, I'll be honest. But they did say, no, this is too complicated, or this is too long, or we'd like to have more time, and particularly more time on drawing. We want to use all these nice art materials you've brought, so we had to lengthen those exercises. But they did come up with these methods. This is actually this was actually a result of one of the workshops in Kenya, or could it be Cote d'Ivoire? And what we asked them to do was draw. We never asked them about their personal experience. We asked them to draw a house in a neighbourhood that they were aware of, a typical house with a typical family in it. And then we said, what are the challenging things? What are the worrying things, which are the green? And what are the happy things inside the family, which are the pink? And in the end, we conducted a further 54 research workshops with 266 children and 251 young people. In total, over the 58 workshops, we had 517 children and young people. They provide 4,738 contributions as to what were the challenges, what were the good things, and what were their solutions. And what was interesting is we reached data saturation. We heard the same things over and over and over and over again regarding the context and the situation. socio-political, religious context, children were telling us exactly the same things. I also interviewed 95 professionals, and we did workshops with 290 family carers, and we adapted the methodology the children had to help co-design to work with families and other caregivers. And this is just a few of the methods we used. You may be aware of some of these. We created a scenario of a young child who had been placed in a certain form of care and asked questions like, do you think this care is suitable? Or this was also, what is important to the family? Is this, we talked about a situation, is this important or not important to the family, etc. We did solution trees with the young people, so they took their worry, their challenges, placed them on the trunk of the tree, and then cut out leaves and put the solutions on the leaves. But then I thought, well, how do I work with children? I don't want to do solution trees. What can I do with younger children? And so I decided to ask them to become a superpower, a superhero, and to use their superpowers and to say, with their superpowers, what 3 things would they do to help families overcome the challenges they'd identified? And this was in El Salvador, and this is a young girl who drew herself a super Luna. And these are the 3 things that she would do to help families. And if my Spanish is good enough, which it isn't, I should have translated it for you, sorry. And then, because we were dealing with some challenging issues and perhaps children didn't want to say them out loud or stick them on the map, we did happy and worry bags, for example, so that children could anonymously fold up their sticky answers and place them in a happy worry bag, with a guarantee that no one else would read them apart from the researchers. And that's something else just to say that these were closed workshops. We allowed no other researchers in. I sat in the first one in each country just to support the researcher, and then totally left it to the researchers, the national researchers, while I went off to do the other work. Very often, and I've used this before as a diversion tactic, if social workers or people are saying, oh no, we've got to be in there with the children, I said, oh, but I don't have much time. Can you just please come and do an interview with me while we're doing the research? And that's a way of getting them out of the room. So we use lots of different creative methods.
About 10 minutes.
Thank you. Okay, great. I'm almost done, actually. And then I was very grateful to work with a colleague in Denmark, Dr. Mosby Jensen, who helped adapt this methodology for working with children so we could engage children with disabilities in the research. Unfortunately, it only happened in 4 of the countries, one of which was in Denmark. But most importantly, in Denmark, we were able to get permission to open special schools. These are day schools, children aren't boarding, with children with very profound learning disabilities. And they came along with their key workers for someone nonverbal. And we've just published on this piece of research, and most importantly, what Dr. Mosby Jensen said is that we really had to ensure predictability, structure, accessibility, and clarity. All of what we were going to do was sent to the schools in advance. The key workers went through it already with the children as to what to expect. Again, gaining consent and as much as possible assent, and everywhere as well I really wanted assent from children. So all workshops started with, this is what you're going to be involved with, this is what we're asking of you, this is how your information is going to be used, it is going to be anonymous, do you want to participate? And it's absolutely important to build this very rapidly sense of trust within a room, so that children, young people feel very confident to say, no, I don't want to do that, and make sure there'll be no consequences. And although information sheets and assent forms have been sent out in advance, we always do this at the start of the workshop to make sure that these children, young people, are not being coerced, that they fully understand they can ask any questions again, and that they actually sign the assent forms in the meetings. So just to say, as a result of this, and I think it's very, very important that our research is then applied. Some of the outcomes is, first and foremost, we have sent information sheets out to all the children and young people who participate in different countries to inform our results. I would very much have liked them to have been part of the analysis and part of the dissemination, but unfortunately, again, in this case, this hasn't been possible. It's very much what I want in my ongoing research. And also, I was invited to New York, to the United Nations headquarters, to present the findings of the research so that we could talk to governments and other interested bodies in the importance of this. And also, to differing degrees in each of the countries we did the research, there has been engagement with the government. And particularly, for instance, in El Salvador, they had a whole 2-day workshop with government ministries on the findings of the research. And I know that now that is being pushed into policy and guidance in different countries, not so much. In Denmark, they didn't use it. So, but I wanted to show that really, if we're taking the precious information that children spend time giving us, it's very important, I think, that that is then applied and used. So that's where I've got to date. It's been a little bit of a stop and start as bits of funding have come along and opportunities to work. I'm very grateful for the international colleagues I have and the organisations that I've been able to work through. What I really want to do now is stop for a little while and think, okay, now learning all of this and from all the other research and work I've been doing, what else do I need to know that would inform the theoretical framework? I take the issue of taking information with and from children and young people incredibly seriously, and that it has to be really, really well and really thought about well. So what else do I really now need to know more about in order to inform the theoretical framework for research? So I want to do more work on well-being, the construct of well-being, the multidimensional aspect of it. What do we mean by well-being outcomes? And most importantly, I have a little bit of money, so I want to go on and do a little bit more consultation with children and young people about, again, their definition of well-being outcomes. I also want to finish the work I'm doing on meaningful participation, levels of participation. What does this look like? Understanding a little bit more about the connection between human rights and well-being. And the reason my title has both of those things in, and it's a little bit long, is because there's quite a large international disability movement who don't want to see any residential care in the world at all. Some have been a little bit critical about us looking at the quality of care because they say there should be no care. But also they've been talking about it's better to talk about human rights and well-being than quality of care. And that's why these things are in the title. And I appreciate that and understand that. Democracy and governance, and learning a little bit more about this, as well as policy transfer theory of change and citizen participation in that process and voices in policy department. And what's the learning on that? And I'm not saying that policy transfer is a bad thing, but I'd like to know a little bit more about what works and what doesn't work. And I did a little bit of that on my doctoral thesis, but I'd like to learn a little bit more now as well. So spending some time sitting, a luxury for me, sitting in a library reading. And then more work on developing the research methodology, so more consultation, looking at funding, and then trying to ensure that these things happen. This is my last slide. The formation of the Children and Young People's Advisory Group so they can actually steer forward the project, formation of an international research advisory group, and looking for implementing partners, well-being indicators, piloting of methodology in X number of countries so that we get a reasonable understanding of what's happening in different regions of the world. And then hopefully having something very concrete that governments can use to investigate their own in a participatory manner. Thank you very much.
So, questions online or in the room?